Hello and welcome. This is the Daily Report for Tuesday, November 2nd here in Korea. Local pharmaceutical companies are actively working to serve as partners in COVID-19 vaccine production and to add their own vaccines to the global market. We have more on these ambitions later on in the program. Let's start now with the broader pandemic coverage. I have Kwon Soa standing by. Soa, tell us.
Well, Sunny, a day has passed now since Koreans could enjoy a shift into normalcy as Korea's Living with the COVID-19 strategy has kicked off on Monday. Now, along with the government's gradual shifting away from focusing on the daily infection numbers, our reports will also follow suit accordingly. But of course, we still are looking at the infection numbers. As of now, we've got 1,589 new cases with 1,578 domestic transmissions and 11 cases from abroad. And with that, Korea has almost 368,000 infections in total and 16 new deaths were reported. That brings the fatality toll to 2,874. Now, since yesterday, we're looking at the number of people in severe or critical condition because that figure is what has to be managed in a stable manner now by the government. 347 are in such condition as of 12 a.m. this Tuesday. And let's move over to our map. We've got 600 new cases in the capital Seoul, 501 in Gyeonggi-do province, and a triple digit remains in Incheon. Meanwhile, also an increase in cases in Chungcheongnam-do province, which has reported almost 70 cases in the past day. And if we take a look at our graph here, we are seeing a slight decrease from Monday, but compared to last Tuesday, it is an on-week increase. Moving over to our vaccination figures, 41.2 million people in the nation, or 80.3%, have been receiving at least one COVID-19 dose, while 75.6%, or 38.8 million, have been fully vaccinated. Now, moving over to global figures now, more than 393,800 new infections were reported in the span of 24 hours. That is a rise compared to Monday's figure, and also a rise in fatalities here, 5,631 cases in the span of a day. And for a closer look at some countries here, we've got some positive news in Brazil, which has posted around 3,800 new cases, but 98 fatalities in a day, and that's the lowest since April 2020. However, there's been still high numbers in the UK and Russia, which posted around 40,000 cases in the past day. I will get into more details on the global updates in a bit, but first I'll toss it back to Sunny.
All right, so thank you for now. Right, Korea's efforts aimed at learning to live with COVID-19 began in earnest on Monday. A number of restrictions have been eased, and for a glimpse of the response to these efforts, I have Jaein here in the studio. Won-jung, good to see you again.
Good afternoon.
Right, so how did things go on day one?
Sure, like you said, Korea's strategy of living with COVID-19 kicked off on Monday. Now, the groups of more than 4 people were excited to be out on the streets and hang out past the previous 10 p.m. curfew. Now, this means no more empty seats in restaurants, and people are getting some much-needed breathing room.
It's been a while since I came to Hongdae. You know, things I would like to do at night, such as drinking coffee, going to a singing room, and seeing people around.
But some people were feeling hesitant about being late despite many restrictions being lifted. Take a listen to what they have to say.
I'm actually so used to the 10 p.m. curfew now. It doesn't feel much different, even if it is with COVID-19 now.
I think I'm going home at 10 p.m. tonight. I think a lot of people are going to be out releasing their pent-up energy, so I'm worried about a spike in infections.
Right, so a bit of mixed reaction there, Won-jung.
There is, yeah.
Right, now I'm assuming, though, that owners of restaurants and cafes are very happy about the lifting of curfews, though.
Absolutely, and it has been almost a year since coffee shops and restaurants were allowed to operate around the clock, and many business owners were very, very thrilled.
When we were closed at 10 p.m., sales were down and customers left early. But we are seeing more customers and increasing sales, now even after midnight again.
But others still worry and concern over a potential surge. Take a listen.
I'm happy that there's no limit on business hours now, but it's hard because we already had to lay off so many staff. This is such short notice. I'm not sure how to deal with it.
Right, well, there is also a bit of uncertainty. Wonjong, Monday also saw the adoption of vaccine passes for those looking to enter venues deemed high risk. What was the response to this adoption?
That's right. So only fully vaccinated people can enter use venues like singing rooms and saunas and gyms. And the questions were raised by some business owners about the fairness about these vaccines. Now take a listen.
A lot of people who run singing rooms and gyms say the vaccine pass are raising issues about the fairness of vaccine passes. Why can only fully vaccinated people use our establishments when pubs can have people who are unvaccinated?
On Monday, which is yesterday, a top health official defended the vaccine pass, saying they were needed to curb infections among the unvaccinated. Also, Prime Minister Kim Boo-kyum on Tuesday warned the public that restrictions could be rolled back if prevention measures collapse. And he urged the public to continue following the basic rules like wearing their mask and keeping a social distance, and also get vaccinated if they haven't done so.
Right, and for those who cannot be vaccinated because of medical conditions, they have the option of the negative PCR test.
That is true, within the 48 hours.
Right, 48 hours, of course. All right, Wonjong, as always, thank you very much for that. I'll see you on Wednesday.
Thanks for having me.
Right, now for Korea, November 1st simply marked its first baby steps out of the pandemic and into a new normal. But for some of its global counterparts, Monday marked an emotional reopening of national borders. I have Soa back at the desk with details on this. Soa.
Sunny, countries in the Asia-Pacific region are especially cautiously reopening on the back of rising vaccination rates and decreasing COVID-19 infections. One of those, Australia, known for its strict and long lockdowns amid the pandemic. For the first time in 18 to 20 months, depending on region, international travel reopened for Australian citizens and residents to travel into and out of the country. Excitement filled Sydney's airport on Monday local time as families and friends separated for months got reunited, with the country's foreign ministry expecting some 47,000 Australians, including permanent residents living overseas, to return following the reopening. Although there are some differences depending on state and territory in general, unvaccinated travelers still have to quarantine, while vaccinated people have to submit negative COVID-19 test results before getting on board. Now here's how the first day felt for a flight attendant.
We got back on the plane and just the atmosphere on the aircraft, it was like pre-COVID. We all got on board the aircraft, we all did what we used to do, and it was just outstanding.
Now, Australia shut its border at the very beginning of the pandemic, only permitting a limited number of citizens to return with a 14-day quarantine. And also that quarantine period was at their own cost if they had to stay for 2 weeks at a hotel, for instance.
I see. Well, as seen in the video, so for family members and loved ones separated by these entry restrictions, the reunions must have been very emotional.
Yes, I can imagine.
Right. Now, staying there, so what about tourists who hope to visit Australia?
Well, for tourists, it's a separate story. In case of tourists, only vaccinated people from New Zealand have been permitted to enter since Monday, but that also not in all states. Now, beginning on November 21st, vaccinated foreigners from Singapore will be allowed to enter without quarantine. So it's really a step-by-step reopening.
Right. What about other countries, Soa?
Sunny, others that eased international border restrictions on the 1st of November were Israel and Thailand. Starting with Israel, which was one of the first ones to roll out its vaccines and also to start its booster shot campaign, is now allowing individual travel to its country. And the excitement there was also felt by travelers as well as residents.
I'm excited to be here after 4 years away, my first time on a Momentum trip, and excited to just travel with these amazing women and learn and study and grow together and have an amazing experience.
Actually, from today, the tourists can come here, and we are looking for them. It's about time that they will come here. We are waiting for them so much, and all this 1.5 years, it was a little bit empty here. And now, from the 1st of November, I think it's a new beginning.
Travelers to Israel have to meet a certain criteria, though. They have to have received 2 doses and pass 14 days before entering, and no more than 180 days after their full vaccination should have been passed before their travel. Meaning those who got their jabs before May cannot enter the country. They would need a booster shot. There are also slight differences depending on which vaccine they are inoculated with. Now, Thailand, meanwhile, is gearing up to boost its tourism market again, as starting Monday, fully vaccinated travelers from some 60 countries are allowed to fly in, including from the US, China, India, Singapore, Japan, most of Europe, and South Korea. According to local health ministry data, some 40 international flights arrived on the first day of the ease, with over 1,500 foreigners and 890 Thai citizens. And this man was among them.
Special conditions, the corona kept me away from Thailand for 18 months, 1.5 years, and away from my Thai wife for 1 year. Yeah? So today is the day, the very first day, I took the chance to come back and hopefully being happy.
So, Sunny, as you can see, it's not only about the joy of traveling again, but really getting back with family members with whom they have been separated for months and months. And actually, although there is anticipation of tourism boost and also the economy to spur in many countries, there are still concerns, not only because the pandemic is still with us, there are still countries that have high increases of COVID-19 infections. Also, people that are in the tourism business are saying that because many people had financial difficulties throughout the pandemic, it's not going to be easy to just go out and about and travel.
Of course, that is the case. Meanwhile, so on a rather poignant note, I believe the UN touched upon a rather tragic milestone that you highlighted during our broadcast on Monday. I'm talking about the loss of 5 million lives to COVID-19 across the world, of course.
Right, Sunny. So UN Chief Secretary General, that is Antonio Guterres, called this milestone a painful new threshold. He said this devastating milestone is a reminder that we are failing much of the world, calling on continued vigilance and especially more efforts on vaccination for everyone. He called it a global shame that wealthy countries are giving out 3rd doses of the COVID-19 vaccine, while only 5% of people in Africa are fully vaccinated. With that, he said the best way to honor the 5 million lost lives is to achieve vaccine equity. With that, he renewed the agency's health body, the WHO's aim to get 40% of the world vaccinated by the end of the year and 70% by the middle of next year. And now let's also take a closer look at the highest death tolls around the world. Here you can see the US does not only have the highest number of infections, but also the highest death toll, followed by Brazil with over almost 608,000 fatalities. Although I mentioned earlier that there has been a decrease in Brazil's death toll recently. And then we've got in 3rd here, India with close to 458,000, more than 458,000 fatalities, that is, followed by Mexico. Now, Mexico here has one of the highest death rates because Mexico is the country with the 15th highest number of infections, but here, as you can see, ranks 4th in the death toll. Russia, meanwhile, has the highest number of deaths in Europe, and according to data, local data there, actually the death toll could be up to 3 times higher. And in India, meanwhile, there are estimates that India alone could have had already 5 million COVID-19 fatalities. So health experts are saying that the 5 million milestone may have been hit a long time ago already.
I see. All right, so thank you very much for those details. I'll see you again on Wednesday.
My pleasure.
The 26th UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties is currently underway over in Glasgow, Scotland. Curtains went up with the head of the UN making elaborate use of disturbing metaphors to paint a dire portrait of the plight we face. Kim Yo-son has our top story.
UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres opened the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow on Monday with a blistering warning over the world's failure to address global warming.
Our addiction to fossil fuels is pushing humanity to the brink. We face a stark choice. Either we stop it or it stops us. And it's time to say enough. Enough of brutalizing biodiversity. Enough of killing ourselves with carbon. Enough of treating nature like a toilet. Enough of burning and drilling and mining our way deeper. We are digging our own graves.
Stressing that leaders need to listen to the planet and act now, the UN chief also called on them to revisit their climate targets, not every 5 years, but every year, as stipulated in the Paris Climate Agreement. Attending the conference, U.S. President Joe Biden assured the international community that the U.S. would stick to its promise of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by the end of the decade.
The United States will be able to meet the ambitious target I set in the Leaders' Summit in Climate back in April, reducing U.S. emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. We'll demonstrate to the world the United States is not only back at the table, but hopefully leading by the power of our example.
Saying more has to be done, President Biden blamed Russia and China for not showing up when it comes to tackling climate issues. China, the world's largest emitter of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that cause global warming, said President Xi Jinping will only be addressing the summit in the form of a written letter. While Beijing said last week it has no new significant goals to reduce emissions, Xi called for advanced countries to help developing countries respond better to climate change. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said it's 1 minute to midnight, calling for countries to get serious right now.
Humanity has long since run down the clock on climate change. It's 1 minute to midnight on that doomsday clock, and we need to act now. If we don't get serious about climate change today, it will be too late for our children to do so tomorrow.
He also emphasized the role of the private sector, saying funding is needed to help developing countries decarbonize their economies. India, the world's third largest emitter of CO2, laid out its 5 goals, including reducing reliance on conventional fuels and switching to renewable energy. Other world leaders outlined their own climate commitments, sharing the view that urgent action is necessary. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
And staying in Glasgow, President Moon Jae-in, for his part, has reiterated Korea's commitment to tangibly address climate change. Our Blue House correspondent Kim Min-ji files this report from Scotland.
At the UN Climate Change Conference, or COP26, President Moon Jae-in pledged before the global community that South Korea will cut its carbon emissions by 40% by 2030 from 2018 levels. That's up from the previous target of 26.3%.
짧은 기간 가파르게 온실가스를 감축해야 하는 매우 도전적인 과제입니다. 쉽지 않은 일이지만 한국 국민들은 바로 지금 행동할 때라고 결정했습니다.
He said Seoul will also join global efforts to cut down on methane emissions by at least 30% by 2030 from 2020 levels, as part of the global methane pledge that officially launched at the COP26. Moon added that South Korea will lead efforts for reforestation and step up cooperation with North Korea on that front. Pyongyang's ambassador to the UK was present during Moon's speech, although they didn't have any contact.
나무를 키우고 산림을 되살리는 일은 기후위기 대응의 중요한 해결책입니다. 사막화를 막고 접경지역의 평화를 정진시킬 수 있는 방안이기도 합니다. 아울러 남북한 산림 협력을 통해 한반도 전체의 온실가스를 감축해 나갈 것입니다.
The South Korean leader also reiterated efforts to completely do away with coal-fired power within the next 3 decades by closing down coal plants and halting funding overseas projects. He also vowed to lend a helping hand to developing countries based on South Korea's growth experience and by boosting official development assistance in green-related sectors. The president also proposed holding the Youth Climate Summit on a regular basis.
President Moon says zero emissions can only be achieved when everyone takes part, highlighting the need to involve the future generations in finding a solution to climate crisis and to speed up efforts toward a sustainable planet. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News, Glasgow.
Meanwhile, on the local front, consumer prices rose by over 3% in October to mark their highest increase in roughly a decade. Our Jaein tells us why.
Consumer prices in South Korea saw their biggest jump in almost 10 years. Statistics Korea said on Tuesday that its consumer price index was at 108.97 in October, up 3.2% on year. It is the first time the CPI has gone above 3% since 2012 and is far higher than the government's target of 2%. This follows on-year rises of more than 2% for 7 months in a row.
This month's consumer prices have recorded an increase of more than 3%, and with the rise in industrial goods, including petroleum products and processed goods. Public service prices were also up this year due to the base effect of the phone bill subsidy given out in October last year as part of the COVID-19 relief funds.
Consumers have seen higher prices at the gas pumps in October as the increase was largely driven by soaring petroleum prices. The price of gasoline climbed by almost 27% on year, and diesel jumped more than 30%. To lessen the burden on drivers, the government is to temporarily cut oil taxes by a record 20% for 6 months from next Friday until the end of April. But some experts say if global oil prices continue to rise, the tax cut might not be enough to effectively relieve the burden on consumers. The rise in prices of agricultural goods has slowed compared to previous months, but some major items on the grocery shopping list have seen rises, including eggs and pork. An expert said the rise in consumer prices is due to a supply bottleneck, but prices are anticipated to rise further as consumers are expected to spend more under the government's Living with COVID-19 scheme.
The government's initiative to boost spending, including relief funds and coupons, will raise liquidity, which will in turn lead to a rise in consumer prices.
He added that in order to stabilize prices and control liquidity, the central bank might need to raise interest rates. 엄지영, Arirang News.
And over in London, Seoul's Finance Minister Hong Nam-gi reached out to potential investors there Monday afternoon, highlighting Korea's prompt economic rebound from the pandemic and more. Our Min Suk-hyun reports.
Finance Minister Hong Nam-gi held a briefing session in London as part of efforts to draw interest from overseas investors. At Monday's event, Hong briefed on the current South Korean economy, including its rapid recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as explained its long-term policy plans to global investment banks and asset management firms. While talking to senior executives, the finance minister said that disruptions to supply chains had a limited impact on the Korean economy. Citing Japan's export curbs on South Korea 2 years ago, Hong stressed that such restrictions helped the country strengthen its industrial competitiveness, as the country can now produce key materials and parts essential for making chips and displays. He said that export regulations have acted like a vaccine in helping to overcome the crisis. The finance chief reassured that the Korean government is paying close attention to secure raw materials and manage logistical challenges. To Morgan Stanley Capital International World Index, which covers large and mid-cap equity performance across 23 developed countries, Hong said that South Korea should be included in the developed market index and that there's good reason to do so. It's the first time in more than 2 years since the government has held an in-person investors briefing session. The last such meeting took place in New York in 2019 before the coronavirus outbreak. During his stay in London, the finance minister is also scheduled to meet senior officials of major global rating agencies such as Moody's Investors Service. Min Suk-hyun, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, major U.S. stock indices marked record gains on Monday on the back of remarkable third-quarter earnings. The gains also come amid a pivotal Federal Reserve meeting. Here's Peunji.
Ahead of this week's crucial meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee, investors maintained buying momentum. The FOMC meeting is set for Tuesday and Wednesday, and they may reveal details on how the Fed will taper the stimulus bond purchases that started last year. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell has indicated the pullback will be complete by the middle of next year, with rate hikes likely to follow shortly after. On Monday, all 3 major U.S. stock indexes closed at record highs. The Dow Jones Industrial Average finished 0.25% higher at 35,913. The S&P 500 rose nearly 2% to close at 4,613. And the tech-heavy Nasdaq Composite added over 0.6% to end trading at 15,595. The Dow Jones briefly traded above 36,000 for the first time on Monday, hitting a new intraday high. The stock market also rallied with solid quarterly earnings from companies despite supply chain issues. According to global provider of financial market data Refinitiv, about half of the S&P 500 companies have reported quarterly results, and more than 80% of them beat earnings estimates. 배은지, 아리랑 뉴스.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. American Airlines canceled nearly 850 more domestic and international flights on Sunday due to staffing shortages and unfavorable weather. The latest wave of flight cancellations pushed the total to over 1,700 since Friday. According to a company spokesperson, the airline canceled more than 16% of its daily total on Sunday alone. In a letter to employees on Saturday, the company said severe winds at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport reduced arrival capacity by more than half, while also noting that they will begin to run tight on staff as crew members end up out of their regular flight sequences. Airlines overall have been running on reduced staffing due to the pandemic, which drastically lowered demand for air travel. However, with restrictions being lifted, airline travel is ramping up, resulting in further staff shortages. American Airlines announced over the weekend that nearly 1,800 flight cabin crew members would return from leave starting Monday, while more than 600 new hires will be coming on board by the end of the year. 2 people were killed and another dozen others injured when shots were fired at a Halloween house party in Illinois. Unfortunately, the incident was just one of at least 11 mass shootings the U.S. reported over the Halloween weekend. According to data from Gun Violence Archive, deadly violence over the weekend left at least 12 people dead and 52 others injured. Mass shootings are often defined as incidents where 4 or more people are killed or wounded by gunfire. Such shootings were also reported in Colorado, Kentucky, Texas, California, Florida, and Oklahoma. Data also show that the number of mass shootings in the country increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. This year alone, 599 mass shootings have been reported, while 611 were reported in 2020 and 417 in 2019. Experts say the increase in mass shootings during the pandemic is consistent with the notion that violence may be influenced by social and economic factors. Archaeologists have discovered what they believe is the oldest industrial wine press in northern Iraq, dating back more than 2,700 years. The discovery coincides with a vast increase in wine demand among the ruling imperial elite of Assyria. Wine is known to have been consumed in various ceremonial practices among the rich at the time. The latest discovery also includes 14 installations carved into mountain rocks, where the upper square-shaped basins were used by people to press grapes underfoot while extracting the juice, which ran off into the lower circular basins. The historic site was discovered by a group of Italian archaeologists working on adding the ancient structure to the UNESCO World Heritage List. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Health experts agree that you are what you eat, and a new study by some of them shows your diet amid this pandemic can, to a certain extent, affect your chances of COVID-19 infection. For more, I have Dr. Jordi Marino at the Massachusetts General Hospital live on the line. Dr. Marino, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me.
Right. Dr. Marino, I believe you headed this intriguing study into the importance of a healthy, plant-based diet to keep COVID-19 at bay. First then, do tell us a bit about what prompted the study itself.
Yeah, sure. Our study was based on what we learned over the last year and a half, showing that COVID does not strike at random. There are some groups of people that are more vulnerable to the disease, and when they got COVID, more likely to get a severe form of the disease. So for instance, these groups of people are people with metabolic conditions like obesity, type 2 diabetes, or coronary artery disease, people living in deprived economical areas, as well as older people. So underlying these conditions, there is the role of diet, which we thought that it might be very relevant in the context of COVID, but we didn't have any evidence of the role of diet on COVID before our study.
Right. So how was this study that involved roughly 600,000 people living in the US and the UK conducted?
So we were fortunate to work with a small company in the UK that launched a COVID symptom tracker application, which was implemented early on March 2020. So when the app was launched, people start reporting symptoms and vaccine and COVID test result information and clinical characteristics. So we encourage people to continue logging on the app until those days, in which people are still providing information. So at some point, we decided to ask these participants whether they would be willing to fill a diet questionnaire to see how their diet were at the beginning of the pandemic and how this diet is changing during lockdowns and mobility restrictions. So among the 4.5 million people that we have in our study mobile phone application, these 600,000 provide information on diet.
I see. So, Dr. Marino, the gist of your findings is that a diet which includes a significant portion of plants reduces a person's risks of COVID-19 infection. What more can you tell us?
So yeah, that was one of our findings. So this is an observational study. What we reported is an association between diet quality, between a health plant-based diet and the risk of COVID, which was about 10%. But what was more important was that the risk of getting a severe form of the disease, like going to the hospital, requiring oxygen support, or having to go to an ICU, were reduced by 40%, which suggests that in the context of the pandemic and global death, efforts to prioritize healthy foods might be a good strategy to reduce the burden of the disease.
I see. And for the sake of our viewers, Dr. Marino, could you give us a quick example of a healthy plant-based diet?
Yeah, sure. So a healthy plant-based diet is a diet that eats mostly from plants, which does not mean that cannot include any animal or other sources. And these type of diets are defined as healthy plant-based diet because they include fruits, vegetables, whole cereals, legumes, and these sources of foods and products that contain high amounts of fiber. As a difference, we can also consume an unhealthy plant-based diet, which would be a plant-based diet which is characterized for potatoes, refined grains like white bread or other types of grains, and also sugar-sweetened beverages. All these other products are also plant-based diets, but are not as healthy as the ones that I mentioned before.
I see. Dr. Marino, given the findings, your findings that is, would it be reasonable to a certain extent to assume that a meat-based diet would perhaps slightly raise a person's risks of COVID-19 infection and of severe illness upon infection?
I would say that more related to the risk of the severity of the COVID rather than the risk. The risk is marginal, even in our study. So I would not presume that a meat-based diet is associated with higher risk of the disease. But what is true is that these diet-related conditions, which are more often driven by the consumption of processed foods and meat, are associated with obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. And what we know is that if we reduce 10% the prevalence of these diseases, the toll of COVID would have been much, much lower. There is a study showing that at least 15% of the US hospitalizations would have prevented if the diet of the population were more towards a healthy plant-based diet.
I see. Well, hopefully people start eating better now that they've had you. All right, Dr. Marino, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you so much.
Back in August this year, President Moon Jae-in made public Korea's goal to become a global hub for the manufacture of COVID-19 vaccines and vaccines for future pandemics. While local pharmaceutical companies have yet to add a homegrown vaccine to the global market, they are currently making strides in serving as productive partners for international production. For more, I have Professor Howard Lee from Seoul National University. It is a pleasure to see you again, Professor Lee.
Thank you for having me again.
I also have Dr. Hong Gi-jong of the Korean Vaccine Society. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Hong.
Thank you for the invitation.
Right, Professor Lee, we'll start with you. As part of Samsung Biologics' fill and finish deal with Moderna, the first batch of the latter's vaccines was distributed nationwide last week. Could we start with a few words on this development from you?
Sure. It certainly is a welcome accomplishment. Samsung Biologics, or SB, has completed successfully the first round of manufacturing, and they also survived the good manufacturing practices inspection by the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety, which basically signifies the quality has been affirmed and confirmed. And this will eventually opens a door of new opportunities, not only for SB but other companies in South Korea, because that basically shows that the quality has been shown in terms of manufacturing vaccines. And also the time for logistics will be reduced. Formerly it was approximately more than a week, but now it will be saved by up to, I think, 3 days or so. And also at this point, all of those 2.5 million doses that have been manufactured will be consumed by local Korean people. But also we have to admit that there are some shades. This is a manufacturing of new vaccines, but this is not true manufacturing because SB has only done filling and finishing, collectively known as packaging. So they have to show that they are also well qualified for manufacturing the drug substance eventually. And also local manufacturing does not guarantee that all those vaccines will be used by local people. So that is something that we also have to take care of in the future.
Right. Dr. Hong, Samsung Biologics signed the fill and finish deal with Moderna back in May. And in late October, that would be last week, more than 2.4 million doses were shipped nationwide. How do you assess the pace of this manufacturing arrangement?
Actually, although a way of production is just simply a battling procedure, but still the production of the Moderna's mRNA vaccine procedure will be performed in Korean Peninsula. That is very big advanced step in Korea for future vaccine preparedness. Actually, Pfizer and Moderna, both innovative company, try to keep their secrets related to the production procedure and the related patents, because those kind of technology will be related to the future pandemic preparedness, and that will be huge their property about the more vaccine development. So first time when the Korean government and Samsung Biologics tried to contact and to propose their collaboration with their mRNA vaccine production, even Moderna's responses are not so positive or smooth, not as shown on the papers or internet. But Korean government, including the KDCA, currently KDCA, formerly KCDC, they keep trying to contact Moderna's, and also Samsung Biologics keep their development procedure, and now we are just take the first step to promote the mRNA vaccine production. It is not the first final purpose of the Korean government or Samsung Biologics, but anyway, it is the first step to enhance our capacity to produce the mRNA vaccine in Korea, and maybe still we need more efforts to advance to next step, such as the antigen production in Korea and the carrier formulation in Korea, etc.
Right, and talking about taking more steps, Professor Lee, Samsung Biologics is working to add an mRNA manufacturing line within the first half of next year, as part of hopes, that is, to expand its manufacturing deal with Moderna. What more can you tell us about the implications of such an addition?
Well, currently, Lonza, a Switzerland company, is producing the drug substance for the Moderna vaccine outside the United States in the world. In contrast, SB has produced a drug product of the vaccine. In other words, filling and packaging processes have been completed. Technically, that is also manufacturing, which is not as easy as it may sound, but not substantial in technological complexity and advancement. Therefore, being able to manufacture the drug substance locally by a Korean company in Korea means a lot. It signifies SB has met the standards and qualifications for technology transfer from Moderna. This also means that Korea can have a stepping stone to develop a variety of mRNA vaccine-related technologies. This is not impossible, but quite frankly, I don't think it's quite likely at this point, because Moderna is not happy to share their mRNA technologies with other competitors.
I see. Dr. Hong, Korea is currently manufacturing 4 brands of COVID-19 vaccines. They include the one from Moderna, AstraZeneca, Sputnik V, and Novavax. What do you suppose makes Korea then a rather appealing overseas manufacturing base for foreign firms?
Maybe the biggest reason for the choice is the capacity to manage the facilities, production facilities, and the highly maintained levels of the expertise to produce the vaccines. So currently, many countries in the world developing the vaccines are depending on the Korean capacities to produce the vaccine candidates or vaccine materials, and this kind of result was from the long time efforts from the maybe 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemics, and then at the time Korean government started to support the domestic vaccine companies, and many domestic vaccine companies try to build the facilities and train the experts, and now we are very prominent ones as a global vaccine hub to supply the request of the many countries.
Right, so it wasn't an overnight goal then. This was a goal that we had thought about more than a decade ago. I see. Professor Lee, Korea is also manufacturing COVID-19 vaccines of diverse platforms, including viral vector, mRNA, and protein subunit. What is the merit of this reality for Korea?
The leading vaccine platforms that have been developed for the COVID-19 pandemic are something that we had never used before. They include, first and foremost, messenger RNA and viral vector vaccines. These platforms are based on new innovative technologies, and they, particularly messenger RNA vaccine, have a huge potential to be applied to other areas, such as the development of a vaccine to an upcoming but still unknown infection, personalized cancer vaccines, and other treatments. In other words, contract manufacturing is the first step to be exposed to those new technologies, and that's why I think the Korean government has been trying to lure Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Dr. Hong, the distribution of locally produced Sputnik V and Novavax vaccines has yet to be seen. What appears to be hindering the distribution of these vaccines?
Novavax
and Sputnik V.
Sputnik, yeah, actually Sputnik 5 and Novavax also developed same as the AstraZeneca's or Moderna's, Pfizer's, but There is it's different reasons for delayed announcement of the vaccines. Actually, Russian Sputnik 5 is the same material as AstraZeneca's vector vaccines, but original developer Russian Gamaleya Institute asked the Korean consortium to produce their OEM products not for the Korean market, for Southeast Asian countries or Latin American countries. So originally, the plan to produce the vaccine materials are not focused on the Korean market. And the Novavax vaccine is a little bit different from the Sputnik 5. Actually, Novavax is a different formulation using the protein synthetic vaccines, and the protein synthetic vaccine development needs a little bit more time comparing the mRNA vaccine stops. So the Novavax synthetic vaccine is still on the developmental stage, and it's on the clinical phase 3 now, and we expected Novavax final approval from the United States FDA next year or sometimes.
I see. So it's very time-consuming, the production of Novavax vaccines. Professor Hong, how do you interpret now Korea's ambitious goal of becoming a global hub for the production of COVID-19 vaccines and for vaccines for future pandemics?
It is absolutely because of vaccine independence or vaccine sovereignty. The Korean government has failed the first time in securing a sufficient number of vaccines as early as December last year, unlike Israel, the UK, the US, or even Singapore. To me, the Korean government appears to naively think a vaccine hub can help solve that kind of problem or issue, if you will. It sure helps to some extent, but I should say it's not the final answer, as I mentioned previously. Local manufacturing does not guarantee local allocation of those vaccines, and furthermore, technology transfer is a big hurdle for the production of the drug substance, or in other words, the vaccine material. That is something that is going to be very important eventually.
I see. And Dr. Hong, Korea's pharmaceutical industry has yet to add a homegrown vaccine to the global market, as I mentioned earlier. But what is the latest on that front? Because I know that advances are being made, though.
Yeah. First of all, as a member of the scientists involved in the vaccine development, it is very sorry to delay the our own vaccine development. But anyway, we are still working very hardly, and some positive result was just before the showing. So I can say several companies, such as the SK Bioscience and the Cellid, will produce our own products next year. First of all, SK Bioscience is using their synthetic protein vaccine candidates. They are almost finished the end stage of the clinical trials, and maybe will be announced their approval from the Korean MFDS, approval government institute next year, early next year. And another company, Cellid, they will maybe they will announce the approval from the Korean MFDS next year as a AstraZeneca type vector vaccine. And also several small size or mid-sized companies such as the Biologics tried to finish their developmental procedure, and at least some items will be announced in the near future.
Right, so sometime next year then.
Yeah, next year.
Right. Professor Lee, I understand some of the challenges for local pharmaceutical companies are related to protocols of comparative clinical trials. Could you explain this reality for us?
Absolutely. When no vaccine is approved or available, it is absolutely possible to compare the efficacy and safety of a vaccine candidate with those of placebo. This is how all of the leading vaccines, such as Pfizer's, AstraZeneca's, Moderna's, and Janssen's, to name a few, were studied. However, now we have all those vaccines available. So it is ethically impossible to compare a follow-on vaccine with placebo. Instead, they have to be compared with any of those currently available vaccines or control vaccines. That said, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to secure a sufficient number of control vaccines on the open market. Logistics is one issue, but that's not the final issue. We also have to deal with the market holder of the control vaccine. are not quite happy to endorse their vaccines to be used as a control in those comparative trials. This is why it has been so hard for follow-on vaccine developers such as SK Bioscience to get a control vaccines for their comparative clinical trials. I think only international impartial organizations such as WHO can intervene in this kind of issue, which of course does not always turn out positive.
I see. Meanwhile, Dr. Hong, I hear that you once claimed while Korea's development of a COVID-19 vaccine may take time, once it is available for the global market, it will secure much trust. Could you explain your view for us?
Yes, I already commented the strong fundamentals of the Korean vaccine industry at the beginning of this talk. So the kind of strong fundamentals of the Korean industry will support the future of our own product as reliable ones. What I mean is that as a global vaccine supply chain, we can produce lots of the OEM products as the best product in the world. But after getting the Korean MFDS approval and SK Bioscience or other kind of domestic company produced our own products, maybe that kind of product will be considered as the best product in the world.
Hopefully that will be the case. Yeah. And Professor Lee, in order to let that happen, what further support do you think is necessary?
With strong manufacturing is only one component of any vaccine help. More than 90% of vaccine exports in the world are currently dealt with by only 10 countries. Of course, South Korea is not one of those 10 countries yet. If you look at those 10 countries, you will easily notice that they are very much advanced, not only in manufacturing, but also in other areas such as equipment, facilities, and production of intermediary materials and basic sciences. So, for example, if you look at Belgium is one of those 10 countries. Belgium has successfully established a strong bio-cluster backed by the government and develop a friendly regulatory environment and global clinical trial capabilities. Therefore, a long-term investment by the government has to be multifaceted.
Right. All right, Professor Lee, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts.
Thank you again.
And Dr. Hong, thank you very much for making the time to join us here.
Thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of the Daily Report. We'll be back same time tomorrow. That is Wednesday. Join us then.